Hi, my name's Danny Dove and this
is Rich Searle.
And together we produce out of the bunker in Surrey. We make music for under aliases such as Danny Dove, West Funk, Offset and a few others. And we're going to show you some tips, some projects in Cubase.
Take a look at yourself and then make a change.
So we're going to look at our top 5 tips, a few things that I think are essential. Number 5, bass and kick. The relationship between those two elements in dance I think is absolutely essential. Many years ago Mark Knight told me if you get that right everything else falls into place, and he was absolutely right. So we're going to look at this track. It's a remix of Halsey's single Without Me, and what I wanted to talk about really first of all was looking at the relationship between having your kick and your bass in key, so musically they sit well, and then beyond that developing the sound of the bass and the kick to give you a really full sound, and the difference between just having an initial bass sound and really getting everything together so you feel like you've got something that's worthy of release. So to start off with, I just want to show you the original bass sound that we found was this, and this is the melody. As far as I remember, this is just a sample from a loop, and I'd heard it and I really liked it, so I chopped it up, I sampled it into the sampler, which is a really easy thing to do in Cubase. You can just drop it straight in, or you can right click on the audio, and then we just changed the start and end points to take the note that we wanted, and off we went, and we played a melody, which was this. I think there's a little bit of EQing on here, nothing major, which will be relevant to the rest of the sounds when we get further in. So the kick that we actually wanted was in D sharp to sit with this melody. But what I've done is I've actually put in a kick that is out of key because I want you to hear the difference. So if I play these two together, you can hear it sounds all right. It sounds like a kick and a bass doing its thing, but when we change it to a kick that's in tune, you'll see that there's a phenomenal difference straight away. And this is bearing in mind no production. This really is just about two sounds sitting together and the difference it makes. So I'll just flick between the two. You can hear that. You can almost hear them singing. So that's the first thing. You really want to think about that and make sure that your kick is in key. There's a number of ways to do that. In this particular case, we managed to find a kick in a sample pack that was already in the right key. So beyond that, what we wanted to look at is the sub, the relationship between that real low end and your kick. You want that to sit together so it's nice and tight. And what we've got here is just a very simple, clean sub. We should just have a look. Which again is just from a synth, and all I've done to this, really, if I play it, you can barely hear it, but it's there and it's been EQ'd so that really you're getting nothing from below about 25, because a lot of that is just taking up room and you don't need it, and then I'm shelving it off at about 114 to 120. So that's occupying that space there, and you can hear it very clearly doing its job. Then you stick your main bass sound over the top, and you've got quite a nice sound, but really at this point it's still very, very boring. So what I want to talk about is how to make this sound a lot more interesting. And the way I did this was, first of all, I felt there wasn't enough body in this bass. I felt like it didn't have that punch to the chest that you need when you're in a club. So I found this sound here, which is, it's very subtle, but if I isolate it, but it's just got a real pressure. So when you add it in there, it just knits that sub and that main sound together. I just added a little bit of OTT, the Steve Duda plugin, which is amazing, Multiband Compressor, and I'm just pushing those mids and those highs, because mainly that mid is what I want, that body punch to sit between the character of the top of the bass and the sub. And I believe there'll be a little bit of EQing on there, using these Fab Filter EQs, absolutely fantastic, can't recommend them enough. Very, very clean, very precision. If you want something that's going to do the job without altering your mix, these are the ones to go for. So now we've got that, but I still felt it was quite boring. So I wanted to add something that was going to add a little bit of bite. So I made this sound. Now this was made in silent or Silenth, and what's interesting about this sound is what's doing most of the work, if I isolate it, is it's quite a straightforward square wave, but it's this cut-off here that's being controlled by this envelope. So if you understand envelopes, great. If you don't, basically what it's doing is it determines how much attack, which means how much of the front end of the sound you hear, the decay, how much of the sound remains, sustain is how long it continues, and release is just the tail of it, almost like the fade off. And in this instance, what I'm doing is we filtered down this sound, which is quite a strange sound, but what it's doing is it's allowing a little bit of the decay to come through to give it that snap and that bite. But where the real work is happening is here. This envelope is actually modulating the pitch, and it's a tiny little bit of decay, very, very small, but it's allowing the pitch to jump and spike. And if I take it off, you can hear, you've got the bite on that sound, but you haven't got that real snap, that real crack. And once you add it back in, you can hear, and when you add that into the mix, it takes your bass from feeling sort of quite. So if I take that out, I'll just turn that envelope down again. I think it was down a bit further. Add it back in, and you can hear now you've got that bite. Then what we did was we added this chord, which is basically playing the root and the third, so to create a bit of melody. Now all of a sudden, for me, it's starting to sound interesting. Very kind of, I guess, future house, maybe EDX. This again, quite straightforward. Actually, no, this is quite interesting. So this EQ here, what we've done is we're pushing that kind of 126 area, the kind of the weight of the bass, just to give it a bit of warmth from that sound. But we're using this mid-side EQ technique. Now, what you can do is, a lot of people are obsessed with width, and it's something that, you know, everyone wants to get their tracks wider, but you've got to be really careful because you can make a real mess of your mix. But what you can do here is actually you can set this so that you have one single EQ that's being split between the left and the right hand side, and you EQ them at different frequencies. So from a psychological point of view, you're hearing slightly lower frequency on one side, slightly higher on the other, and you feel like you're hearing different sounds. You also hear them in different places in the spectrum, which instantly makes that sound wider. So if I bypass this and then I bring it back in, you can hear it widens that sound up. And then finally we've got another layer which is playing that same chord, the root and the third. I'm not entirely sure, there will be a reason for it. We'll have a quick look. Okay, so this is just a little bit of air. What I wanted was to get that little bit of sparkle on top, that bit of tinsel. And in terms of processing, just got the OTT on there, just kind of squashing it a little tiny bit. And again, we've got an EQ here, not doing a great deal, just taking out some of the harsher high frequencies and just giving me that higher sparkle around 2.5K. So when you bring them all back in, and if we add in some of the other elements, so we've got some basic drums, which we won't focus on, nothing too clever about these, other than the fact actually I've just noticed that these two hats, so this is the mid hat. It's a good way of making your hat sound more expensive. This is the main kind of hat and snare loop, and then I've added these two hats which are panning left and right, and they instantly make that hat feel richer and wider because one of them's sitting out on there, and then you've got one hat down the middle, so it makes it sound nice and expensive. But if we add those drums in, a couple of really simple vocal effects, nothing major, just cut some vocals up from the original, moved them around, added some reverb. And that's really just for atmosphere, because the bass is doing the majority of the job, and when you hear the finished track, it sounds like this. And if I go back and just remove all those layers that I added to kind of give it extra character and just go back to the basic bass, it's doing the job, but it doesn't feel like a little bit of magic. So I'll bring it back in. There you go, so that's kick and bass.
Okay, this is going to be a nice quick tip on how to avoid one of the things that we hear a lot in tracks, which is reverb smearing. So when you've got
long reverbs, reverb tails that are longer than the gaps between your notes, then you often get a build-up. So essentially you play one chord, by the time the next chord hits, that previous chord is still ringing on the top and it becomes a bit of a mush. And you can hear it on this. The longer it goes on, the less distinct that sound gets and the more harmonics are building up in the background. So a couple of really simple ways that you can deal with this are, if you set up a sidechain input on a compressor, which I'll show you here, what we're doing here with this compressor is we've set our sidechain input to be the actual signal itself, which in this case we just rendered down to a piece of audio. And what that means is every time the note hits, the compressor ducks the reverb out of the way. So the initial part of the note is essentially fairly dry. And what you're hearing is the tail, and the tail of the reverb builds up as the natural decay of the note goes away. So that means that you get far less kind of crossing over, which you can hear here. Hear the reverb between the notes, but it doesn't smear the front. And we've also further accentuated that because the best way to clean things up is if you can reset your reverb. Now we've done this in a fairly basic way, but every time you bypass a plugin on and off, obviously you're completely resetting the signal. And if you do this, which we've done, we've drawn in little bypasses before each note, you can probably get them an awful lot smaller than we have done here, so you don't get any gaps. It means that each time that reverb is triggered, it's only picking up the signal from the note just after the bypass. Nothing from the previous chords will be carried across. Ultimately you end up with a very clean signal. You still get the effect of the reverb, but you don't get the washed out smeariness. You can keep the impact, you can keep all of the transients. And that's what we do to keep our reverbs clean. Okay, so next tip. One of the things I suffered from for years was organisation, and I have to say, now that I've got my head round it, it makes a huge difference when you're managing large projects or you're trying to run a business and you've got deadlines. So one of the big things I would recommend to any new producer or any producer who's been around a while and hasn't done this yet is to set yourself up a template. So I want to run through our template, which we have set up as a preset, so we can double click on it and we can open it up straight away. And you'll see very quickly why it improves workflow. So the way we've set this up is, first of all, we've got folders for our drums, our bass, keys, synths, leads, guitars, vocals, effects, and anything miscellaneous. Now, you can name anything you want. We've got them in different colors, so it makes it very easy to see where they all are, especially when you're working with 20 or 30 drum stems, you know, maybe 4 or 5 bass stems, etc., etc. You can imagine it gets really messy. We also, by default, add in a sidechain. It's something we use all the time, and I think that's the main thing, is you want to add those things in that you've noticed you use every time you do a project. We actually use the Vengeance multiband sidechain. We really like it. It's very simple to use. You can use a signal from your kick or any sound, and you can actually split the frequency. So here we've set it to 230 or 223 hertz between the low and the high. The low is fully sidechained out the way to keep it clean, and the high we adjust as and when for each project. So we've always got that in there. Effects, we've set up 3 basic effects that we use all the time, which is a stereo delay, a reverb, and another reverb, which is slightly different, just doing a different job. So they're there, ready to go every time. Finally, in the keys section, we have a piano ready to go. And that's just because when you want to work out some chords, some melodies, and you want to be quick, you don't want to have to waste time loading up that synth, finding it. It's there, ready to go, and you just play and off you go. So it's quick, it's effective, and you can focus on creativity rather than this kind of the other stuff. The one other thing to mention is that in each of these folders we have a subgroup, and when we've organized all our sounds, for example our keys, we'll drag all those layers into that folder, and then we'll send them all to this keys group so that we can then control the volumes of each section, which when you're doing that mix down and you know your drums sound good but maybe they're not quite right against the bass, rather than have to adjust lots of channels, you're just managing 6 or 7 faders, and it really does save you time, and it's a lifesaver. Other than that, I think that is about it.
Okay, we're going to talk you through what is a fairly typical mastering chain for us?
So, I should probably point out in the first place that we don't tend to mix directly into a final mastering chain. Tend to find that when you're dealing with peak limiters, that kind of thing, if you're mixing, you're almost fighting against your master bus. You're trying to deal with things that have got quite high dynamics, and the things on your output are pulling them down and pulling them up, and it can just kind of make the whole process a lot more difficult. Second to that as well, sometimes I think being able to take a step back from a mix and dealing with it as a separate 2-track rather than having too many things that you can fiddle with at the time gives you a different perspective and can often yield better results with mastering. So all of that being said, I'm going to talk you through this chain. I'm going to bypass everything to start with. Now this is the master of the remix that we did for Chicane of their single Nirvana. So let's give you a quick play of the unmastered version. Okay, and I'm going to step through this one plugin at a time. The first port of call for us is going to be a very basic EQ. So what we're dealing with here is we're getting rid of the extreme lows, which you don't want because they're going to interfere with your headroom and not really audible, and the extreme highs, which do much the same sort of thing. And then it's a very basic shaping process at this early stage. So we're just giving a bit of a boost in the mid-range area, a bit of a dip in that low mid-range area around 400 hertz, often a bit of a sticky area and can create kind of mud in your mix. And in this particular instance, that kind of low 75 area is giving a bit of a hump. And that's not doing anything particularly major, it's just a very basic shape that's starting to pull the record into the place that we want. Next stage, this is going to look like a strangely similar process of another EQ, but this is a bit different. This is one of the great things about the FabFilter Pro Q3. Because you can set it up as a mid-side EQ, basically what I'm dealing with here is we've got a very, very aggressive low-end cut, but all we're doing is taking the low end out of the stereo. So the mono's remaining completely intact, but everything below, in this case 104.6, we're taking away that kind of flappy bass because you don't want stereo down there. It's disruptive to the focus of your mix, and again takes up valuable headroom. And the more of this stuff that you think it's not really causing any trouble, you probably can't hear, it's just ultimately going to make your record quieter or mean you're going to have to drive things a lot harder and create distortion and such like. So that is quite invisible in what it's doing, but what it's probably giving me is maybe an extra 2 or 3 dB RMS value at the end that I wouldn't have been able to get. Next on from there, we're dealing with some very basic compression here. Nothing particularly aggressive going on here. I mean, it's very, very marginal, the amount that it's actually taking off. What this is really doing is it's a preparation process. It's preparing the track for limiting later down the line, because it's just bringing some of those transients back into line, so that the final end of the processing is not having to do so much work. Next step on from there is a bit more EQ shaping in this case. Now we wouldn't always do this, but obviously at this point felt that something had changed in terms of the tonal characteristic that we want to correct. So we're dealing with very, very broad cuts and boosts here, and very minor, half a dB here, half a dB back up there, half a dB down here, well not even that, and you can see that it's, again, just putting things back to where we wanted. You'll probably notice that individually a lot of these processes don't seem to be doing a lot. Kind of characteristic of the way that we master is that we have quite a lot of things doing a little rather than one thing doing an awful lot. Okay, and after that we're dealing with a bit of multiband compression. Again, not aggressive, but we've got a nice little thing going on here where you can hear it's controlling the very low end. It's tightening it up. It was pretty tight in anyway, but this is just giving that extra bit of solidity down there. Little bit of work going on here. This third mid-range band is actually expanding really rather than compressing. Just felt like it needed a bit more presence. Up here, very little happening. Very little at all. Now, next stage, and this is where it gets really good, I think. This is an amazing plugin. This Slate Digital FGX, which was actually marketed as an all-in-one mastering unit. We don't use it as that, we use it as part of a chain. The compressor's great. It is what you'd expect it to be. It's without any character. It's very, very, very transparent. Very good at just kind of bringing your peaks into line. But where the real magic happens is in this FG level section, which has the capacity for injecting insane amounts of volume into something without actually damaging the audio. They're very cagey about how this works. I'm not entirely sure. It's not a peak limiter. I think I read somewhere that it uses some kind of tailored saturation curve to deal with making sure you can maintain transients and maintain dynamics, but also increase loudness. And the really useful thing with it is it has this constant gain monitoring switch here, meaning that you can hear the effect of the processor, to the point when it becomes ugly, without being tricked into thinking it sounds good because you can hear the signal getting louder. We're all kind of victims of the fact that when something gets louder, we think it sounds better. So actually having something that enables you to genuinely hear the process and not be swayed by something all of a sudden getting bigger in your ears is a really useful thing. And that's the final stage we go to before our last bit of peak limiting. And again, it's not doing a great deal. You can see by the way the meter's working, it's snatching at peaks rather than flatlining. So even in the really aggressive peaks, it's taking 5 dB off. It's not running as a 5 dB kind of hammering limiter, and it's not taking away all the dynamics, which means you still get that nice shift between breakdown sections and drops. But it also means that because we've prepared for this limiter through this whole chain, almost everything that we've done has been kind of building up to preparing for this. It means that we can keep the track sounding fairly dynamic, but we're still getting, in this instance, -7 RMS or thereabouts, which is pretty loud. Not as loud as you can go, it's pretty loud. And you hear, that's where we started, and that's where we end up. I'm sure this is preaching to the choir, by the way, but we should also just say that don't ever think about mastering as a means of fixing something that's broken in the first place. Get it right in the mix in the first place. The mastering should really not be doing any more than the last 10 or 15% and should just be preparing the track for release rather than trying to make good something that isn't good in the first place.
Okay, so final tip. I think this is a really important tip. Make sure you got plenty of tea. We recommend a PG with a full fat organic milk, but it's entirely up to you, but it's something you need to consider, something you need to get right, and it's something you need to maintain.
Always tea.
Okay, so next up we're going to look at a track that started life originally as a bootleg, was played by a couple of guys I know and myself, became a real kind of end of night track, one of those real sing-along moments. So we decided to take it a little bit further, develop it and see what we could do with it. Now, in this, what I wanted to do was kind of show you the process of how I get to a finished track, or how we get to a finished track. And so I've loaded up the first project, the initial idea, the original record. I'm going to talk a little bit about the thoughts that I had about it and where I wanted to go with it, and then we'll fast forward and look at how we develop that into a full track. Because I think it's really important to understand that, you know, we just don't make ideas and they suddenly happen and they're suddenly amazing. Sometimes we go down dead ends, sometimes things don't work, sometimes sounds need loads of crafting and we have to delete complete sounds and start again to try and get them sounding right. So don't get disheartened, you know, if you are a new producer. You know, just keep making sure that you keep crafting those sounds and getting them as good as possible. So this originally was a Michael Jackson record, Man in the Mirror. And the first version that was made was actually a down-tempo 100 BPM record. So I'm going to play this to you so you can hear it. Not all the way through, but just some clips. And it will give you an idea of what we got sent.
I'm gonna make a change for once in my life. It's gonna be real good. Gonna make it.
So you get an idea, quite a sort of gentle, slightly kind of marshmallow trap feel to it, and then it builds up.
As I
Brings in some bass and some piano, it's a nice moment. Then transitions across into that main part of the vocal that gets everyone singing along, which is here.
Each other on the wind, you know, 'cause they got nowhere to go. That's why I want you to know I'm starting with the man in the mirror, and I'm asking,
And then finally the drop.
make a change. Na 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 na.
So that was the original record. Now, as soon as I got sent this, I had an idea and I wanted to get to work on it. So I didn't have the parts at that point, but I just wanted to get the idea down so I could remember it further down the line. So what I did was I took this track, I dropped it into the project. Something you can do in Cubase, which is great, is you can figure out the tempo, and a really simple way to figure out the tempo is to cut the beginning of the track to the first beat, line it up so it sits on the bar, and then just check this isn't set, which it is, so I'll turn that off. And as you can see at the moment, the beats aren't lining up, but what you can do is you can change the tempo down here and keep moving it until you see that it lines up, and you can check it. And again, you can even add a click if you want. So now I know that this is 100 BPM. I want it 124 BPM. So what I can do is I can double click on that audio file, click this little button here, this little musical button, and I set this to 100, which is already done from before. And now what that will do is it will control this file so that if I speed the main project up, it will speed it up with it. So now we've got this track running at 124. As you can see. So the next job in the project was to work out the chords. So again, simple piano and just figured out what they were. So from there, it was really about coming up with an idea. So the first thing that I tend to do is I will stick in a kick and a clap just to give me something to root to. So we've got that here. And then I had the initial piano, which I then played around with some grooves and some rhythms, and eventually came up with this that I was happy with. Very simple, not too much going on. Then put the bass in, which again is just following those chords. Nothing too clever. Basically a very default sound from Nexus, one of their hacks. And then I added some hats. So now I'm getting a vibe and I can play around with this. And the other thing I wanted to add, or the idea that I had, was to add this stab melody, which is following the rhythm of the chords, but has these little flourishes throughout here. So you kind of get this slow and quick feeling, and it's this very much kind of future house envelope synth. So it's got no bite on the front of it, and it's very quick. You'll know the sound. So it was this. And the way I made that sound was, this was a sample that I found in a sample pack. So I dropped it into the sampler and I just set it to the root, which originally it was in E. So I sat that there, and then I can play it as a melody. And I think this is just a horn sound, yeah, from Nexus. Again, actually it's a plucked sound. Just to kind of give me enough flavour to feel creative. And then from there I ended up layering a couple of extra sounds to the piano just to make it feel fuller. So a little bit of top here, which I used Serum. Again, just a preset. So I think the important thing is, at this point in the game, what I was doing was really just trying to come up with an idea that gave me enough of an inclination of where I wanted to get to. So the finished result would sound like this. And again, I'm still using the original track, so I've got no parts.
And no message could have been any clearer. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and then make a change.
And that's the idea, and I think it stands up, so I left it at that. So now we're forward on, and I'll show you how we broke down all those parts and developed them into a finished track.
Okay, so that's all we've got time for right now. Please come back for part 2.